Welcome to the WLab'ing podcast, where we talk with the most influential personnels who are paving the way for the future of filmmaking. Today we are with Noah Kadner. Noah Kadner.
Hey guys.
I can give you a brief introduction, and then you can add on to that. So Noah Kadner is the virtual production editor at American Cinematographer Magazine. Also, he's the founder and editor of The Virtual Producer, a multimedia website dedicated to news, resource, and innovation. Noah also hosts the Virtual Production Podcast, and he's also the author of the Virtual Production Field Guide series at Epic Games. I think you know yourself best, so why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm also an amateur chef. I'm very well trained watching the Food Network. So yeah, I have a lot of skills. But as far as virtual production goes, it's definitely right up my alley. I've been doing this as a writer for, longer than I can remember now. And yeah, I would say my day-to-day work consists of just playing with all these technologies and reporting back my findings to fellow creators out there and seeing what is possible to do with all this new filmmaking technology.
Right. Tommy Wu is a co-founder of WLab. Thanks for being with us today. Why don't you just kick us off?
I personally know Noah for a while, and the first time I met Noah is also online, virtually, in a virtual production class at Tisch, School of the Arts with NYU. Mm-hmm. Back in the old days, we still do the virtual production in your living room, and that was a lot of fun. And that's how I started doing virtual production, and that's how I see the huge potential in the industry. And that's one of the biggest reasons that we started WLab. A huge thank you to Noah to get me started. And so since now we're in the same industry, I'd definitely like to share a bunch of insights that we figured out during our couple months, quote unquote, in the business right now. I'd also like to hear your feedback on the new stuff coming up that also interests us a lot as creative technologists and just passionate filmmakers.
Mm-hmm.
So, first of all, let's kick us off talking about the cool Netflix series 1899. What are your thoughts, and what are some constructive feedback?
Well, I'm not going to. You know what? I do not purport to be a filmmaker at a professional level at something like 1899. So I would never tell those guys what they should have done better. But I will definitely give them props for doing an amazing job. Not the least of which they were able to accomplish all this stuff in the middle of the pandemic, which I think is actually what motivated them to do it with virtual production versus their original plan, which was to kind of go around all of Europe and film this multinational kind of seafaring mystery series that they made.
So the first big project that kicked off the popularity of virtual production, or the buzz of virtual production, is Mandalorian. But what was your first personal experience in the world of virtual production?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends. That's one of the things. One of the things that I do in addition to all this writing stuff, well, I guess as a kind of addition to it, is I help with a website called the Virtual Production Glossary. I think it's vpglossary.com. And basically that's an attempt to sort of collect all of these terms and help kind of figure out, what we call things, because some of these techniques are being invented on a daily basis. And then you have a crew that has to know, what you're referring to when you want to use that technique. That's to say that virtual production to a lot of people today just means LED walls, when in reality, the term was really coined around the early 2000s when they were shooting Avatar. And it was originally called virtual cinematography, but that sort of slowly morphed into virtual production, which we now kind of take to indicate any sort of technology or workflow that involves the physical world and the virtual world. All that said is, I would say maybe the first time I had an experience with it was watching the first movie Avatar back in 2009, because that was an intensely virtual production. And as far as the first time I saw that in person, I think it was maybe 2017. I was invited to view a demonstration at Technicolor where they had LED walls, but they were still too low resolution to film, but they were being used for reference for the actors to do mocap. So that was the first time I saw that kind of a stage that was combining real-time animation with LED screens. And that was my first question when I walked in the door. I'm like, when are those screens going to be good enough that instead of just being reference, they can actually be the image? And everybody was like, well, this technology needs to grow a little bit. The screens just don't have the pixel density to look like realistic in front of a camera, but, surely that will happen soon. And, a couple of years later, that's what happened.
Wow. Okay. So after watching the Avatar, that was your first kind of hands-on experience with understanding what virtual production is. How did you decide to dive more deeply into this industry?
Well, I mean, it's because, like I said, I've been writing for American Cinematographer. I first started writing for them around 2005. So I covered a bunch of movies. I got to visit a lot of movie sets. I went to Vancouver and observed the shooting of Tron Legacy. I got to go to London and see all of the Star Wars sequels movies being filmed. I think I'm the only journalist that was interested enough to see all three in person. All of that is just to say that since we're always covering whatever the latest and greatest trends are in the magazine as filmmaking goes, this kind of naturally fell in my lap. I'm probably the one that cares the most about the latest technologies at the magazine. So I mean, it kind of just naturally fell to me to cover this stuff.
Wow. Did you know you were going to do this as a young person?
Well, I kind of took a circuitous route. I wanted to be a filmmaker from very young, and I went to film school. Actually, went to film school out in California at a rival film school we won't mention. And so I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I spent about 10 years in LA after I graduated from film school, just kind of bouncing around. And it was right around the time that we were getting rid of film cameras and going to digital cinema. I found it really hard, and so I got a job offer to be a consultant at Apple up in the Bay Area around after that 10 years, and I kind of leapt at it because it just sounded a lot more doable. And so here I am kind of back coming at it more from the tech angle than the production angle. And it's been great because I'm sure, as you guys know, hustling to be a filmmaker is really tough. And so if you can find some other avenue that maybe lines up a little more with your skill set, which in my case was, being more into analysis and sort of research, then it's been great.
We talk a lot about virtual production, but I want to hear your thoughts on how you would describe the term virtual production, especially to someone who has never touched it before. How would you describe the term?
Well, it's just, is there a process that might have normally been something you would do in post-production after filming that now is happening in front of the camera? Are you live animating a digital character with mocap and seeing the results live as you're doing it? Are you going into a VR headset and visualizing a scene and walking around it in real time? Basically just anything where the animation that's happening in front of the camera or around the camera or on the way to the set is happening in real time versus a post-render process. Because that just makes a big difference. It's a lot easier for people to kind of understand something and sort of come to a consensus about what they're trying to make if it can be conjured up in front of the camera while everybody's standing there versus we're going to shoot green screen, we're going to put some tracking dots on the wall, you're going to look over here, and trust me, when this movie's done, it'll all look right. The actors don't like that, cinematographer doesn't like that, so this is just a way more interactive process.
And Unreal Engine, as a game developing company, came in and kind of revolutionized the film industry. And I've heard you say during another podcast how as a gaming company they are making billions of dollars and they're able to spare like millions of dollars to help with the film industry without any risk. And as filmmakers, we have this reliable tool that we can always use for virtual production. And what are your thoughts on Unreal Engine, Epic Games as a company, and what they're doing to revolutionize film production?
Yeah, it's interesting. It really changes the economics of it because just about every other company that has anything to do with the movie business, that's their only business. Whatever they're selling, they have to sell enough of it to remain in business. And so that's why you've got cameras that cost $60,000 and lenses that cost $10,000 and tracking systems that cost $30,000 plus and LED screens that cost $1,000 per module because they have no other business to subsidize it. Whereas with Epic, their main business is making video games and it's what they've been doing for decades. So for them, filmmaking just is kind of a nice little corollary to that. And it's not something they need to really support to stay in business. So we as the filmmakers really benefit because they can just make that tool free because they don't need to make money with it from filmmakers. Every other tool that's out there that you might use for this task has to be subsidized by sales. So that's why if you want to get like a Maya subscription, you're talking $2,000 a year, or if you want to buy, just about any other software that you might do this kind of work with, you're paying money. Whereas with Unreal, you're just paying for the assets and the software itself is free, which is just great because anybody can do it if you have a computer.
And Unreal Engine, they recently rolled out a tool called the MetaHuman Animator.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? And do you think using the Unreal Animator, if that technology gets good enough, it's going to completely replace LED productions?
I mean, I think that stuff maybe has even more utility for gaming because obviously in games you have to film stuff with mocap. You don't want to have that kind of old school like 1990s video game look where the cinematic scenes are clearly like full motion video shots and they're just like a movie that plays back. You want to have characters that have dimensionality so that, you know, the player can kind of move around them, and having really high fidelity facial mocap is always important for video games. And of course it has use for digital characters in movies as well, but them making that more accessible and easier and higher quality is always welcome because the infrastructure you need to do that up until they release this product is still pretty high. In fact, I'm actually looking around today for a good headset and helmet mount for an iPhone just so I can play with it, because I think it sounds like from what people are saying, it works best if you have something that can keep the phone in front of your face while you're moving versus like if you just put it on a tripod, as soon as you go like this, you're kind of losing half your face if the phone doesn't go with you. So. But yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential, and it's awesome that they put that out there because, again, it's like a tool that is kind of aimed at video game making, but also has a lot of use for filmmaking. So we're kind of riding those coattails.
I think it's super cool how you're trying all these new products and technologies right there at home. I know a lot of indie creative technologists who are doing that. Do you have any tips for someone
Who's just like starting out on virtual production?
and they want to just experiment at home? What should they do?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you can afford a decent gaming computer, which, you know, maybe $1,000, $2,000 to get started, that's all you really need to be able to start playing around with Unreal. And if you master Unreal, not only will you be doing a lot of the stuff that the quote unquote professionals are doing with the same exact tool, but you'll also have kind of a leg up, because if you were to show up at a virtual production stage and be like, I'm a master at making environments in Unreal Engine, or I'm really good at mocap, or I'm really good at sequencer animation or whatever, right off the bat, they're gonna be like, great, I'm sure we have a place for you. Whereas if you show up and you're like, I love this cool stuff, but I've never seen Unreal, they're gonna be like, well, we're not really hiring anybody right now. You know, I mean, it's a very marketable skill. So that'd be where I'd suggest to start with, because it's very low entry point to get into, and it has a ton of cool things you can make with it. And with that skill, you're very marketable in the job market.
I would love to learn more about your setup. How did you set it up, and how did you put it all together?
my setup here?
Yeah.
So yeah, I currently sit in the living room here in our house, and it doesn't look like that. It actually looks like this, which is not nearly as impressive. The idea is this wall that's behind me was originally intended to go to my wife's production house down in Mexico City and be used in a studio there. We saw these particular screens at an IBC trade show in Amsterdam, I want to say in fall of 2019. And we started talking to manufacturers, and we put in an order around the end of 2019, and they delivered right in February of 2020. And we had it all set up, sitting in a warehouse in LA, ready to go to our freight forwarder in Texas to go down to Mexico City. And then the pandemic hit. And we're just like, it doesn't make any sense to send this down to Mexico because we're not going to go down to Mexico for probably the foreseeable future. So we said, why don't we send those screens to our home instead? They showed up, and you know, over the course of about 2 months, we slowly opened up the boxes, and kind of a little bit at a time, when we weren't busy. When we finally had it up and running, it was like, oh great, you know, we have a little virtual production stage. And we started adding in all the other stuff like tracking and cameras and lighting, and you know, slowly learning. And it was wonderful. I mean, the pandemic sucked, but it gave us at least the opportunity to educate ourselves and spend a lot of time just learning how all these technologies would work, because there wasn't a whole lot else to do. It became our sort of pandemic hibernation project, and it worked out great.
Right, and at the same time, you were helping with film schools to develop their virtual production classes. And Tommy, did you ever shoot anything in Noah's living room?
Yeah, we did. I did my final project virtually in Noah's living room. Do you still remember my giant pig for the shoot?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That was the fun part. So we did all these projects with NYU, and the only sort of requirement that each project had was that it had to basically star me, because I'm the only person willing to get in front of a camera in this house. So, and you know, again, this is in the middle of the pandemic, and so everybody became very flexible about the parameters. But yeah, this particular one was me as this drunk guy in a business suit, sort of waking up and having to face off against a giant pig. So there was like a digital character and me like sitting there like interacting with it on the screen. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Noah, can you talk more about the class that you collaborated with NYU, and what are some fun parts and what are some interesting findings?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say what we definitely proved is that there's a lot to be said for doing productions remotely, to the point where we've continued to do those kinds of productions where some people are in the room and some people are on a Zoom call. And having the stage itself, the living room, you know, wired up for streaming is perfect for that, because we can show what's being filmed through the camera. We can cut to a side view so people have the context of the room and sort of can educate themselves about how the images are made. Again, under very challenging life circumstances, but professionally professionally super interesting because I come from that world of, everything's got to be on the set and there's a lot of standing around and waiting, and there gets to be a certain size of movie crew where it just gets very hard to deal with. And so having it boiled down to just the camera operator, the actor, and then everybody else is in a Zoom call, comfortably observing and interacting, that just, to me, was the best film experience I've had. So I loved it.
Wow.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, we did a 48-hour filming challenge where we had our director zooming in from Savannah, Georgia, and directing the whole production crew here in New York City. That was a hectic but fun experience. We learned a lot from it. The biggest lesson I learned is I need to find a way that I can connect the director from Zoom into all the intercoms that the production crew are talking into. The director feel like she's being disconnected from a lot of the crews. But the whole process is a lot of fun. We got some really nice footage.
Yeah, I think the workflow aspect of that project was probably our biggest takeaway.
Yeah.
And honestly, that class that you guys were talking about was probably a huge inspiration for why we did that.
I was taking a lot of the elements from the class and apply it into the workflow. And we're really trying to actively improve upon like what we had and all the mistakes that we had.
Right.
Better video streaming feed. Yeah. Better audio quality for directors and whatnot.
Speaking of education, Noah, as an educator, what's the best way to get current film students who know nothing about virtual production into this field, and what's the best way to, teach these classes?
My experience with education is to the point of, I used to be an Apple certified instructor, so I could teach people Final Cut Pro, I could teach them Logic. So, I think more than anything, the takeaway I get from that is people really learn by doing. You can only really, especially filmmaking, because filmmaking is kind of part theory and part just kind of people skills. Some people are great on sets, some people are a disaster. When I was in film school, you could tell there were certain people who were just planning to get their degree and then never doing anything in film because they realized really quickly they couldn't really stand the process of filmmaking. They liked movies, they liked the idea of it, but the actual building of it was just not for them. I think having that exposure is really critical. Coming to sets, nowadays there's so much creator and influencer opportunities out there. We talk about this all the time, like we should just run a YouTube channel for all the stuff we do out here. And I'm trying to set that up, but I really want to connect with somebody big in Hollywood because the goal of this is to have guests that are, really at the high end, and I need somebody who's got those connections. So anything you could do to kind of get your hands onto it. I know NYU is in the process of making their own Scorsese virtual production center, which I'm sure will be a really great opportunity for students to come in and be hands-on with the setup that's essentially being constructed by the same people that do The Mandalorian and stuff like that. So that's a great opportunity.
I think it's super important for these IDE stages to be accessible to students. As you said, hands-on learning is probably the most important aspect of education in virtual production and film in general.
Why not we switch topic and talk about climate change and how virtual production can help, or can it?
It's funny. It's one of those things where the people who kind of came up with all this stuff, those kinds of considerations were probably the last things on their minds. But, it's great that it just so happens to work out that way. But yeah, if you guys wanted to go film in that sort of mountainous environment you're sitting at right now and have your couch there and your mics and the crew, you'd be spending all this time and money and you'd be wasting a lot of carbon emissions to fly everybody out there, put them in a hotel. Maybe you would have helicoptered up there in a couple rounds in a nice helicopter and, there'd be a big generator off to the side providing power and, versus you could just sit in your stage and run off of standard electricity and everybody can be there and you're not destroying the beautiful, lush environment. This recent Transformers movie was shot in Machu Picchu. And I'm just like, I'm sure they did some damage there. That's a very remote location and they have this giant, robot attack scene and they're blowing up Machu Picchu. So, it's like to be able to not do that kind of stuff and leave a much smaller footprint, I think is extremely valuable. And throw out an apology to my buddy Tom, by the way, who's a producer on that movie. I'm sure you guys did your best with Machu Picchu, but just to call you out as a familiar example.
Virtual production is great for all, maybe great for the environment, save money on set, keeping all the crew in a safe environment while you shoot in the most dangerous environments.
Not too cold, not too warm, indoors.
Right.
What are some of the restrictions you see in the current stage of virtual production that we're currently trying to improve on?
Well, you can always make things look more realistic. So, there's a constant struggle to increase the quality of everything you're working with. Like, for example, the screen that I have behind me is kind of the second sort of generation of this setup. When we started out with this screen, we had 2.5 millimeter pixel screens, and that was state of the art when we started in 2019, really. And so earlier this year, we moved the 2.5s to another facility. Actually, they finally went to their intended home in Mexico City, and then we got 1.5 millimeters in here, which is great because, where I sit, I'm I'm like 6 feet away from the wall, so the camera's maybe 8 feet. As anybody who's been on one of these stages knows, the closer you get to a less dense wall, the more likely you're going to see the screen texture, and you're going to end up with interference, moiré patterns, and just all kinds of objectionable stuff. So that's the big challenge, I think, is just keeping all this products current. And, every time we rev it, we're trying to make it look higher quality, more realistic, but of course, not lose our shirts in the budget to actually accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. So improvements in LED development really helps us to give more of that creative freedom in terms of shooting closer to the screen, this and that. What does it take to make something in virtual production look realistic? What are the elements?
Well, it's a combination of everything. I would say it's having a high quality background environment to start with on a screen that has been calibrated properly or can be controlled, that has good video processing going on, that is big enough for your setup. I mean, for me to be able to do a close-up shot on my teleprompter camera, I don't need that big of a screen. If I were doing a scene where I'm sitting in a car and you need to see the whole car, obviously I need a larger screen. It's making sure you have the adequate size screen for the types of shots you're trying to do. And anything that can take away from that illusion, shooting with a camera maybe that has too much depth of field, so you see it becomes more obvious that things are not as far away as they appear to the camera, having lighting that matches the environment. It's a combination of all those things, and it kind of comes down to the eye of the director of photography to kind of decide if something looks optically believable or not, and whether the environment needs to be increased in its quality, or whether the lighting needs to be changed, or the way the foreground set is built, or different lenses. I mean, all those things can influence how it looks.
How do you blend the physical environment to the virtual environment in a very seamless way, right? What's the most impressive, realistic virtual production you've seen, and what are they doing differently?
I mean, I would say what they did on 1899, to come back to that for a second. I mean, that was very impressive to me because you have the deck of a ship, you see the ocean in the background. I mean, that's a no-brainer for a screen. But there's scenes that they did in this like dining room set where it looks like a big, beautiful ballroom with hundreds of people seated at tables enjoying a very fancy dinner. But if you look at the set, it's like maybe they had 5 or 6 tables in the foreground, and most of the background tables were in the screen, complete with characters that were walking around, digital characters. And it just looked very seamless. They had like lighting that was both in the real set, but also continued on in the background, like chandeliers and little, like old style, like oil kind of lamps and stuff. It just looked like a big room. I mean, if you didn't know that it was filmed on a screen, you probably would never guess, just because it just had that dimensionality to it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an art. It's a magic trick, really.
For the people who ask me, what is virtual production? I always send them that BTS video of them filming 1899. It's just, it gives such an overview of what it takes to do a production of that scale. And that LEDs they shot, it was freaking massive. That brings me to another topic. What are the advantages of large virtual production, just these mega-sized virtual production studios versus the ones like ours at WLab, which is much more timid, little tiny, very cute, but I think we still get the job done.
Yeah, it's still a decent sized wall.
Mm-hmm. But we cannot compare to what we use at 1899.
Yeah, I mean, I did this article actually, I guess it was this week, because I was actually talking to someone from the Netherlands, actually, who was doing like a dissertation or something, who wanted to know more about techniques. And we were just talking about, whether there's one right size, like the Goldilocks sort of zone. Like it's not too big, it's not too small, it's just right. And it really, I believe that is absolutely the case, but it depends, I mean, obviously, if you need to do big action scenes with dozens of actors like The Mandalorian, you need like a 70-foot wide screen, no doubt. But if you're doing a movie about 2 people in an apartment, you could probably get away with something really small. Maybe even just a TV screen behind a window on a regular set would get the job done. So I think that's really a key consideration, especially to people who are thinking about building one of these stages as a for-hire kind of studio. You really need to sit down and say, okay, what is the existing market for such a studio in where I want to build it? Are there going to be enough customers? If I build X size, I need to rent X rate per day. Is it likely I'm going to fill that up, or am I going to go out of business just from building this thing? Or do I have an investor that doesn't care and they're willing to give me like years of runway losing money? All those factors should really be considered, because as much as I wish I could say, if you just put one of these up in the middle of nowhere, suddenly you'll have all this insane business at $50,000 a day rental. That is definitely not the case. So you've got to do that business plan before you think of anything, because the tech is kind of solid at these days. It's not like you got to reinvent the wheel. I mean, you know which products you need to put together and what software and what people to run it, and you'll have a screen. I mean, that part is not tricky anymore.
What are some of your favorite technologies that really pushed forward the filmmaking process, especially in virtual production? And what are some technologies that you're looking forward to that you think is going to drastically change this landscape?
Well, I mean, I would again throw the props to Unreal Engine, because I mean, all of the other stuff that's in one of these sets are technologies that have been around in some form or another for a while. For example, there was a TV show on ABC for a number of years called Once Upon a Time, which was actually a very cute show about kind of fairy tale characters from the Disney back catalog sort of coming to life in this eastern seaboard kind of town. They would occasionally go into these fantasy sequences where you'd see them in their storybook worlds. And they did all that with kind of sort of virtual production, but not really. Basically, they would shoot stuff on a giant green screen. They'd be using camera tracking. They had a preview where they could see how the set would look, but they were not able to get to the point of like final imagery as they were shooting. So it was like they were filming green screen, then they'd go into post-production, do the final composites. And, it looked good, but sometimes it looked like they were walking through like a PlayStation 1 game, which is a bummer. But doing that on a TV schedule, I think, honestly, that The Mandalorian doesn't get as much credit as it should, because if you have 3 years to make a movie like a feature, then anything goes, like whatever you need, you can probably knock out. If you're looking at something like Avatar: Way of Water, where they were in production for almost a decade, it's like, sure, you can make it look perfect. But on a TV schedule, it's like you got to knock out content where you film something at the start of a month and it may be going out to broadcast at the end of the month. So you really got to have your act together. And to be able to do something that's Star Wars quality visual effects on that kind of schedule, that takes a lot of thinking. So, all of that is to say that what the engine has brought as far as live visual effects at what used to be post-render quality, that cannot be overstated how useful that is. And as far as stuff in the future, yeah, I mean, all these generative AI tools that are coming out of nowhere have a lot of application. It strikes me as possible that in a few years down the road, you'll start to see movies that were never filmed. There were no actors in front of the camera. It was like completely generated out of thin air, which is kind of terrifying to maybe camera manufacturers and people that have, made a living in live production. But I mean, it's hard to deny that's not a possibility.
Right. Runway. Oh, they are doing a crazy good job at generating AI movies. What are some of the other competitors in that field who are using AI to generate videos?
Yeah, no, Runway is interesting. I've been playing a lot with that. In fact, I'm actually doing a project next week where we are, I don't even, see, this is, again, coming back to terms, I don't even know how to explain it, but essentially we're going to film some live action scenes that will be used as the source imagery for generating new content in Runway. So what we do is we'll shoot with a phone, just because it's easy and why not, an action with a camera movement in a particular location, and then we'll wash that through Runway, giving it a reference image of how we want it to really look. And what I've discovered is yeah, I mean, those tools have a lot of potential, but where they are right now is surprisingly random what you get out of them. Sometimes the imagery you get out using the same prompt twice in a row looks exactly like what you had in mind, and sometimes it's like a nightmare that comes out of these things. So I mean, it's like, I think that's going to be the real challenge, is to get it to the point where it's still easy to use, but I have enough control that I can predict what the output looks like and have consistent results so that it looks like a real movie and not kind of sort of like the dream of a computer, which is how some of this stuff looks now.
Right, that's something to really consider, is how much parameter should you give to the users? How much creative control do you give them without making it way too complicated and for them to not be able to understand it? I think Gen 1 right now, I think you're essentially taking a video of whatever you want and then using Runway as a tool to stylize it. And with that style, you can kind of put in any prompt. I kind of played around with it. I had a friend film a video of just toiletries and turn them into skyscrapers.
Yeah, I did a scene where like I filmed just a car driving across the street, and then I fed it like a still from a Pixar like Cars movie, and it like came out like all anime. I mean, it looked really trippy and weird, but I mean, it was like you could see how if that tool were made more predictable and maybe with a little bit more control, because the controls they give you are really abstract. It's like you have a slider that is essentially a percentage of how much influence you want your source imagery versus your reference photo to play in the final generated image. And I've just found the results are just all over the place. So I mean, again, it's these things are such in their embryonic state, but you could absolutely picture if they kept improving it and adding enough control to the point where it was as predictable as like Adobe After Effects or Unreal Engine, as far as like you do these parameters, you're going to get this result every time, then I think that could pose a fairly significant change to the way movies are made.
How do you think AI is going to be used in virtual production?
Well, I mean, it could potentially replace a lot of what we do now. I mean, they already have really good AI motion capture tools. I mean, I have like an OptiTrack optical mocap system in this room now, which is like about a $70,000-$80,000 setup, and it's amazing. I mean, I can put on the mocap suit and I can animate a digital character, and it looks as good as anything you've seen in any video game because it's the same technology. But if I didn't have the kindness of the folks at OptiTrack to provide all this and let me play with it, I don't know that I could afford that much. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the idea of a solution that is markerless, like something like Wonder Dynamics, where you just feed it video footage and it essentially extracts the actor's movements somewhat. I mean, obviously nowhere near as accurate as what you could do with a real mocap setup, but I mean, a lot of potential. Mm-hmm. It's, again, I think it's kind of, lowering the floor and raising the ceiling, as we say, just giving more opportunity for people who want to do this stuff without saying, and you need $90,000 to do it. It's like, what if you just need your phone? That's great. Everybody's got a phone, right?
I kind of see the pattern of the less physical elements a technology involves. For example, wearing a mocap suit, that's a physical element. The less of physical elements you have, the more potential a technology has, if that kind of makes sense. For example, if you're using like Move AI, I mean, that's only going to get better. And sooner or later, it's going to get really good at fingers. And later you know it.
And faces. Lip sync,
You can do that in real time. And you're going to essentially surpass all the technologies that require a lot of these physical elements just with code and the machine learning.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of this stuff, I mean, it's people look at that and they're like, oh, it's putting people out of work and it's making these companies obsolete. But I mean, if you were to look at the film business, the way movies like these were made in the 80s and the 90s, that's a completely different business. It was like they were shooting things on film, then film could be scanned to digital and manipulated, in the computer, or it was just done completely optically. And there was a whole businesses when we went to digital visual effects and we went to digital cameras, there were entire industries that just disappeared overnight because they were obsolete. So, I mean, if there's one thing that teaches me in the film business, it's like, you got to be ready to constantly evolve. If your goal is to be an artist and just like, whatever the tool is, I'm going to master it and tell my stories, you're all set. Mm-hmm. If your goal is to be like, I'm going to be an Unreal Engine operator, you might not be in business in 5 years if that's all you know how to do, because this stuff just changes. I mean, when they first started proposing how they were going to do The Mandalorian, most people thought that's crazy. Like, you can't do visual effects live on a giant TV screen. Like, that's not going to work. You need to do green screen. And sure enough, they proved it was possible, and now everybody wants to do it. Things evolve and update, and if you want to do this stuff, you've got to just embrace a constant evolution.
Absolutely. Technology changes all the time, but your ability to tell story, that's what's going to keep you in the business.
Well, it's like, it's hilarious to me, for example, that people are doing all these AI Wes Anderson movies on YouTube, right? Because it's almost like saying, even though it's state of the art, the technique, they've identified that that's a filmmaker that has such a specific style that it can be transposed into whatever new medium is coming. So, I mean, like, Wes Anderson, you're set. Like, no matter what filmmaking becomes in the next couple of years, I'm sure you can preserve your style and your director's flourishes, and people will still be able to recognize that's a Wes Anderson movie no matter what the technique is involved. Whereas if you're a more generic, like, I just want to call action and cut, maybe you don't have quite as much of a future in some of these possible outcomes. So, yeah, embrace the art, I say.
Embrace the art, develop your style. I'm super interested to hear your opinion on when you think a film made completely in engine on a computer, no camera involved, will look identical to something shot on a camera.
I think that's happened several times already. I mean, when you're watching Avatar: Way of Water, most of that movie is completely digital. There are some scenes where human actors come into shots and they're being blue screened or vice versa. But I mean, I think it's more just, I would say the question I would ask is not when will a movie look photoreal that's completely digital, more as when will all movies be shot that way?
Sorry, let me rephrase when is everyone going to have access to that technology?
I think we're getting there. I mean, you look at, again, you come back to the MetaHuman animator in Unreal Engine. I mean, that basically gives you the kind of facial capture quality that was only accessible to people who had, those really high-end mocap head-mounted camera rigs that was then being processed through all kinds of... there's a whole division of digital domain who just does digital facial capture research all day long. And, it's because they got to give you Thanos and they got to give you Gollum or whatever. So, that's a whole cottage business right there. And now you can do that level of quality right on your phone. So, it's like, yeah, these things are becoming more and more accessible by the day. You can tell that when you listen to Tim Sweeney talk about this stuff, in his mind, it should be a cottage business where any little mom and pop who wants to make their own little virtual world and have a storefront on it that somehow generates income should be allowed to. We've always been dancing around this concept of when is the metaverse coming? And everybody thinks the metaverse is going to be this like one single thing that looks like Ready Player One. Right. And it's like, no, that's not, it's just like the internet. People are like, oh, the internet's going to be this information superhighway. It's like, it's actually a bunch of little mini fiefdoms that cross over. And, some of them are more popular than others. And I think that will be the same way, whatever the metaverse. I think also Facebook kind of blew up that term by putting it in their company name too. I don't think nobody wants to give them free press. So like when Apple did their headset, they didn't even mention the word metaverse because then they're giving a free ad to Meta. So it's like they kind of poison the waters right off the bat with that. So it's just going to be a shared experience in 3D, I think, is what we're talking about.
Oh, let's talk AR, VR. It's a great segue to that. What are your thoughts on the new Apple Vision Pro?
It's funny to me because it's like these things go through cycles. Like when I was a kid, there was this movie called The Lawnmower Man in the 90s that came out that was kind of like a Stephen King adaptation. Basically the story in that is like a guy uses VR to help rehabilitate his disabled next door neighbor. And in the process, he becomes super smart and suddenly becomes this sort of rogue AI cyborg guy. And you know how it goes, like big action scenes ensue. But it was like VR in that movie was this almost like sci-fi kind of concept of this giant headset where this guy was like floating around in this big room. And it was like the kind of proto Matrix. And so seeing that get boiled down to something that now Apple is offering up as a very polished looking product, I think that's interesting. Whether that becomes something people become comfortable with. You guys both wear prescription glasses, right? If a headset looked like that, everybody would wear it. Whereas I think we're still in that moment where it's a giant ski goggle on your face or almost like a night vision headset that is not something you'd want to be sitting on the subway with or whatever. So, it's like we still have a few generations to go before the technology is really what I think a company like Apple would prefer to offer to people. They'd love it if it was like a Barbie Parker looking set of specs and, you could see the whole virtual world through them.
I'd love it if everyone started wearing glasses,
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, in the future you wear one of those glasses that you can just like see stuff.
I'm sure they will ultimately get it down to the point where it's something that just you put on the back of your head and just somehow wirelessly transmits the imagery to your brain, or contact lenses or something. It's like you can see where they want to be, but it's like the technology of this very moment is only capable of giving you this nice goggle.
Would you put a chip in your brain though?
I would, if they could figure out a way to do it to where it was like a patch that you just, like a subdermal patch, I'd try that. But having something like surgically implanted through my skull, I don't know. That sounds like a bit much. Because Bluetooth cuts out all the time. Could you imagine like you're trying to have a thought and all of a sudden you're like, hold on a second.
Sorry, I'm lagging.
Bluetooth's cutting out. Hold on. Somebody please turn off that blender. Okay, I'm back. Yeah. That would be pretty terrifying.
I'd be down to try it.
Who knows?
Just not the first version. I'll try Gen 2.
No, exactly. I want like the version 7 of that.
Yeah, we really go into the future, right? So it comes down to our final question for today. I got a lot of questions about your setup, especially when I go to Tish and people really talk about like what you have in your living room setup and how like people can really build a mini virtual production stage in their living room. Can you talk about your living room?
Oh yeah. So yeah, this is where I sit, and essentially when we film, so where I'm sitting is like a desk that's plunked pretty much in the center of the room with the screen behind me. When we do filming, what's great about this is this desk is all on wheels. And so we push it off to the side, we move this camera off to the side, and we bring in, actually technically this camera, which is a much bigger like cinema camera, and then we can film stuff. So that's kind of phase one, is like have a nice, decent, big open space. We're lucky in that this particular room has very high ceilings, so we could build this screen up to, I want to say it's currently about 9.5 feet yeah, it's maybe half a foot off of the ceiling, and same on the side walls. It's actually closer to the walls than anything. I mean, you can see you can't even fit back there now. It's like there's a side on this side you can kind of squeeze around, but it's built almost up to the wall on that side. And so, yeah, I mean, you would need that. You need decent cameras, you need tracking systems, and you need a decent render node for pumping out Unreal Engine, but you do all that and you kind of got it. You could certainly start, like we have another room in this house that just has a big OLED TV, like a 80-inch OLED TV, and sometimes if something's happening here or we're doing maintenance, I'll just sit in front of that for my calls. Either of those things is a viable way to kind of get started if you want to dip your toes in the water, so to speak.
And you still have the pixel mapped lighting right next to you.
Yeah. So for example, right now, let me see if I can call this up. So the way it works is I have a system that so right on either side of me, like to my left and to my right, are two lights from Lightgear called Spectrum 4s, which are basically 4 foot long by about 2 feet wide. They look like, just big flat rectangle lights, but they're colored lights. So what I can do is I can essentially take the video feed of whatever's going to the background and use that as a source in a program that takes a screenshot of that and basically tells the lights to mimic it. So right now I have it set to where they're just white, but if I said, let's mimic the background, then I do this, and now I can pick exactly which section I want to sample. Like, for example, in this background, you can see there's like a little fire pit down there. So I'm going to scooch the light on that side to mimic that fire pit.
Whoa.
So now I've got a nice little flicker effect going on.
Such a good Zoom setup.
I'm going to boost up the overall level a little bit so it's a little brighter on my face. And maybe I can probably open my exposure up a tad just so I can see a little better.
This is what I want for my living room.
I can confidently say this is the greatest video setup of all time, hands down. No competition. Have you ever met anyone with a better setup?
There's one guy, Michael Cioni, who used to work, this is interesting, he used to be head of product at Frame.io,
right.
Super smart guy, who actually resigned so he could start his own AI company. I'm talking to him about that next week. He's about the only person I get on the phone with who consistently has an even cooler looking background. But, that's about it. Most people are like, I mean, this is a lot to show up. I mean, even when I talk to somebody who runs their own LED stage, most of the time they're just on their phone walking around in the lobby or something. So it's like,
that's us right now.
Exactly. Yeah. No. You guys have you guys are definitely in the same league. But just to close it out, that's the other thing is if you only have a backdrop of a flat wall, you need to add something that can mimic it. Because, for example, if I turn off these front lights in here, then it's like, the only thing that's lighting me now are the computer screens on this desk. You need to have that setup ready one way or the other. I'm going to go back to just pure white, and I'll take it down a little bit.
The impressive part is it's so automated, and it's so smart. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did. So there's a lot of remote desktop kind of software I use, and then also I have it set up. Some of the things in this room I have it set up on smart plugs, so I can actually turn this wall off with a voice command if I need to. I tell it to turn it off, and then it just goes off. So it's like all that is definitely doable.
What's the next toy you're gonna get? What's the next thing? Next upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I actually need to go back and play with a lot of the toys because we got this OptiTrack set up about a month ago. Actually, we've had it for longer than that, but they finally had a chance to come out and help me build it. So I need to play with that. Next week we're doing this generative AI shoot. So I think that's kind of my next, big plaything is seeing what it looks like if we try and shoot an entire movie with that technique, because some of the results, like I said, are really impressive, and some of them are just like, it burns my eyes,
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Do you have a script yet?
Yeah, it's fun. It's actually hilarious because I'm producing this with a couple of friends that I went to film school with way back in the day. The last time we did a movie together, we shot it on 16 millimeter. We edited it on extremely low resolution Avid workstations, which at the time were state of the art. And then we went back and cut negative and did a projection and did like a photochemical print of our finished negative. And all that, to be honest, sucked. It was so painful. And it was like so much work to get to our eyes what looked like a pretty, amateur looking image. So to bring those people back and try it again now with these state-of-the-art tools, I think is going to be really fascinating just to see, like, oh, wow, this is easy now. So, I mean, looking forward to that.
For sure. Thank you so much for being with us today. That was
Pleasure.
a lot of fun chatting with you again.
I'm sure this will turn out great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I will be in New York actually this summer at some point. I'm coming out to do about a week just to visit, so I suspect I will probably cruise by and check you guys out if you're around.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
We'll
We'll
be
be here.
around.
We'll be here.